As an Islamic financial sector practitioner, I recall it was probably some 6 or 7 years ago that I started to engage more deeply with an involving industry dialogue about Maqasid Al-Shariah and the impact that it could and indeed should have in shaping the further development of the Islamic financial market and actually the actions of its stakeholders and its participants. We've since moved forward in extending consideration to the substance, objectives and purpose behind our compliance. And at the forefront of that thought leadership has been Professor Dr. Mohammed Akram Laldin. It's my privilege and indeed my honor to have this opportunity today to be part of the discussion with Dr. Laldin about that relationship between Sharia and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And my sincere thanks to the UKIFC in partnership with the Islamic Development Bank and the Global Ethical Finance Initiative for organising this session within the context of the overarching event. Dr. Akram, today you're launching in partnership with the UKIFC a thought leadership paper incorporating the Sharia scholars' perspectives on the SDGs. Many perceive that there's a natural alignment between Islam and the SDGs. So could I ask you, Dr. Akram, to share your personal insights about that relationship with Sharia and the SDG, and perhaps to highlight for us some of the key principles of Sharia that are very supportive of the SDG agenda?
Okay, thank you very much, Stella. And as always, it is a pleasure to have engagement with you. And at the beginning, I would like to take this opportunity to thank UKIFC for inviting me to share my thoughts. And I would also like to thank UKIFC for partnering with ISRA to produce the thought leadership paper. And indeed, I believe that the release of this paper is timely, as at the moment, as all of you are aware, that we are embracing new norms with new environment during this challenging time, and we need to look forward on how to boost the social values of what we are doing. And I strongly believe that these values are always embedded in the SDG. Now, briefly, perhaps before I go further, Stella, I would like to highlight some of the findings that we have when we have this thought leadership piece we were developing. And the very purpose of it is that for us to get the insight from the scholars and what do they know about SDG, what is the relationship between Sharia and also SDG. And interestingly, we managed to interview about 10 scholars, well-known scholars from different parts of the world, some from the Middle East, some from Africa, and some from Southeast Asia. And they have shared their thought with us on the different area related to SDG and how SDG, come in relation with Maqasid Al-Shariah and also, the entire framework of Islamic finance. And no doubt, I think through this engagement, generally we find out that the scholars are of the view that SDG are compatible, you see, with the general objective of Sharia, you see, and there are some details, of course, that need to be worked out, particularly when we talk about developing the framework of SDG. And this, I believe that it is more towards how do we interpret the SDG. And I strongly believe also, even in the conventional space, when we talk about compliance to SDG, we find that, there are, different jurisdictions, different institutions might have their own framework in developing it. So generally, we can say that the scholars are of the view that the very goals that the United Nations have put, they are in compliance with Sharia. And perhaps, by empowering SDGs, this is also an opportunity, of course, for us to present the value proposition of Islamic finance, the world economy. And I always mention that when we talk about all these beautiful values, they are part and parcel of Sharia, and we have to really drive it. And I think one aspect that I would like to emphasize here, scholars, did mention, is that how can we utilize, the different tools that is available within, Islamic worldview in order for us to push the agenda of ESG, of SDG. And they did mention about how can the institution of zakah, for example, the institution of waqaf, endowment and whatnot, be used in order for us to advance, the agenda of SDG. So that, is what we find out from the scholars, Stella.
Thank you, Dr. Akram. I'm really looking forward to drilling down further into that work and the reflections of the scholars. But I think it's good that we can start our discussion together today on such a positive note. But I noticed that you alluded to the need to create framework and to have further engagement between the scholars. And I think despite the natural alignment that many of our industry stakeholders observe between the objectives of Sharia compliant financing solutions and the targets objectives of the goals, there are certainly some aspects of the broader relationship between Islam and the SDGs that might not be considered such a comfortable fit. And I'm assuming that you're alluding to that when you talk about further consideration and input by the scholars as they create the framework. I think it'd be interesting if you could expand a little bit more about where you perceive there might be some resistance or where perhaps some areas of dislocation might exist.
All right, thanks. Again, you see, when we talk about the broad objective of Sharia, or I think the very popular terms that we are using nowadays is Maqasid Al-Shariah. You see, we see that the very principle in Maqasid Al-Shariah, which says Jalbul Masalih wa Dar'ul Mafasid, meaning that the Sharia is there to fix and it aims at establishing what is beneficial for mankind and to preventing what is harm from mankind. So we can see that it is a very broad principle, in which it is the role of the scholars, the practitioners, and I think the different stakeholders for us to come into the detail and look into how do we apply this broad principle. So meaning that whatever that bring benefit to the people, it is good, it is very much encouraged by Sharia, and anything that bring harm, we should prevent it. You see, and if you look, I think from here, where the perspective of the scholars come from, where they see that, you see, the Sustainable Development Goal do align, you see, with this very important principle in Sharia, that it bring benefit and it prevent harm from the people. Now, I mean, you mentioned that there might be certain areas. Yes, I mean, there might be certain areas that, Sharia have its own view on certain areas. Yes, I mean, no doubt. That's why I was mentioning earlier on that the focus should be when we talk about integrating SDG within the framework of Islamic finance, for example. Of course, as all of us are aware that Islamic finance is guided by the very principle of Sharia, which is built upon the Quran as well as the saying and doing of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. You see, so we have to ensure that, you see, whatever details, whatever framework, you see, whatever steps that is being taken is in line with what is there in the Sharia. So here is the challenge. I always believe about it. And sometimes it is very much according to the interpretation. That's why if you look into the different approach that is taken by these different jurisdictions, sometimes different institutions in empowering SDG, we can see that each and every one of them, I mean, they will look into what are the priority in their jurisdiction. Take, for example, if you're talking in certain country, perhaps, I mean, providing the basic food, zero hunger, for example, that is the priority. You go to certain other country, maybe the health service is more to be given the priority. So it all depends. And of course, when we talk about putting all this value, it might differ from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction. But of course, I mean, there are certain areas in which Islam has its own view. I give you one example about the gender equality, one of the SDG, where, of course, I mean, if Islam do recognize, you see, the right of women and whatnot, You see, but there are certain principles in which Islam has its own stand. So I always believe that when it comes to developing the perimeter, each and every one of us should develop it based on the jurisdiction where you are in, based on the circumstances where you are in, based on the need of the people where you are in. So of course, I mean, it is not wise for us to bulldoze, for example, our own values, you see, and impose it on others. I think this is, you know, the kind of environment that we are looking into. How can we harmony? And I think that is how the scholars are looking at the SDGs broadly.
Thank you, Dr. Akram. Yeah, your comments are noted and well made. And that conversation that I alluded to that was taking place, you know, some years ago when we started to reflect more solidly at a practitioner level, engaging with the scholars on Maqasid. Actually, I came to Malaysia to have some of those opening discussions. And I remember one theme that came from that was identifying, in the context of Sharia compliant financial practice, the role or the evolving role of Sharia scholars in looking at embedding sustainable and responsible financial aspects that might be more relevant perhaps to other sustainable and responsible financial subsets and outside of our core Islamic financial marketplace. So I think I'd like to ask you, when situations concerning the implementation of the requirements of the SDG within the context of the Muslim faith do arise, what do you consider to be the role of the scholars in addressing and resolving them? And when I think about some of those discussions around just Islamic financial practice, is it reasonable that this should fall within the scholars' remit and within people's expectations of them?
Of course, thanks. Interesting questions. Perhaps, you see, if I can perhaps bring you, you know, I mean, a little bit, you know, about the history. When we first started Islamic finance, you see, I can remember that the focus of the scholars at that particular time is very much to provide a halal solution, meaning that if a person wanted to buy a house, how do the person do it in a Sharia compliant way? So the focus at the beginning was very much on the legal side of fulfilling the requirement of Sharia. Now, as we advance, right, as we advance in the industry, I would say that now, perhaps with the standards that has been developed, with the different fatwas that have been developed in the industry, interestingly, we can see that more or less, you see, the legal aspect of Islamic finance, Sharia, related to commercial transactions and whatnot. I mean, it is, I'm not saying that it is complete, but I think most of the big issues we have already addressed it. Now, I mean, here comes the role of the scholar. So what is next? Okay, and people like me, you see, I'm not satisfied to just stop at my role to look into the legal aspect of Sharia, but then I would very much like to go into the looking at what is the impact of whatever product that I have already approved at the Sharia level. So I think, this is, a natural, evolvement that we can see that in the industry that it is taking place now, particularly after the financial crisis. We have seen that people start, asking, hey, what is the value proposition of Islamic finance? Are we just, looking at what is then conventional and trying to imitate what is then conventional and providing, similar solution with conventional and whatnot? So I think we need to address it. So as a Sharia scholars, you see, I believe many of my colleagues out there, they also share with me that it is important for us to address, you see, what is the next step that we have to go. You see, that is the reason why I always ask myself that, okay, whenever I see a product, you see, I will not only stop at looking at the product that it satisfies the legal requirement, but I would like to know, okay, what is the impact of such product to the society, to the environment, to the whole universe as a whole. And I need to look into this, because at the end of the day, the Sharia tell me that anything which bring harm, I should stop it. Sometimes there are certain things which it is perfectly compliant with the legal requirement of Sharia, but not necessarily it is compliant with the maqasid, where it might bring harm to the society. There are many examples around us in terms of investment. Where do you put your money and whatnot? Generally, it might be in compliance with Sharia. There is nothing in Sharia says that it is prohibited. But when we look into the impact of certain things, for example, it is detrimental to the environment. It is detrimental, to the next generation, weather and whatnot. All these have to be taken into account. And I strongly believe that that is the direction in which we, the scholars, are moving towards it in the next phase of the development of Islamic finance.
Thank you, Dr. Akram. Useful indeed for we practitioners to think about the presentations and submissions that we make to the scholars now, and really the layering of consideration by our scholars as they move through their reflections and their approval processes. Beyond that form that I think, so a couple of decades ago we were used to prioritizing into the underlying substance and beyond into the impact. You gave me a fine opportunity to ask you a little more about your own perspectives, and thank you for speaking so openly about those and that of many of your colleagues as well. I mentioned at the beginning that I identify you with thought leadership in this area, and you certainly have a dual role within certain of your mandates. For purposes of disclosure, I should say that as a member of DDCAP's esteemed Sharia Supervisory Board, we've also managed to persuade you to act as our sustainability champion, which we appreciate and we're thankful for. But in taking such roles, does that offer to you and indeed to your colleagues, amongst other Sharia scholars, the opportunity to push to accelerate financial sector firms' individual approaches to embedding and adopting a more proactive approach to delivering against the requirements of Maqasid? And that might impact us deeply into their business models, the shaping of those, and also their policy formation. And I'd like to take that even a step further. And do you think that our current understanding and interpretation of Maqasid actually requires further reflection by the scholars, and maybe to enable to push the firms that you advise a little bit more?
Okay, thanks, Stella. I think first, I'm honored actually to be given the opportunity by DDCAP to play my role as the member of the Sharia board, as well as my role in the sustainability agenda. And I think, I really benefited, from the various discussions that we had in our Sharia board, where we always try to take this opportunity to push the sustainability agenda in the market and also among the scholars. And I think this, to a certain extent, has created a greater awareness among the scholars on their role on the sustainability agenda. At the end of the day, for me, it is not an option, but it is a must. As we know that, when it comes to empowering the Maqasid, we have to do it. It is not an option. Perhaps in the past, we might say that, it is an option, but now, no, it is no more an option, because of what is happening in the country, across the globe. You see, with the pandemic that we are experiencing now, with the weather that we are looking, how the global warming and whatnot that we are looking now. So for me, it is not an option anymore for Sharia scholars to just keep quiet and just approve a particular product based on what is brought to them, but they need to go beyond what is there. Now, coming back to your second part of the question regarding, do we really need to relook at the Maqasid and how do we define Maqasid? How we put the details of Maqasid? Yes, And here I would urge, you see, the Sharia scholars as well as the market practitioner, we need to sit down, we need to, really have more discussion. You see, the tendency in the past, sometimes I would say that among some people that, they will consider or they have this kind of perception, whatever that comes out from the Sharia scholars, as if it is a revelation from God. You see, I'm saying that no, it is not a revelation per se. Yes, we are guided by the text, by the Quran, by the Sunnah, but at the same time, we need the input from the market, you see, on how do we move forward. There are certain aspects of the product that we are approving, you see, our colleague, the practitioners see that it might bring more harm compared to the benefit to the society, to the economy, to the environment and whatnot. I think you need to tell us that, this is one aspect of it and this is another aspect of it. So please do look into this aspect. I think the other side of it is that we need to also educate the investors and also the public at large that we need to really push the sustainability agenda, because we are not talking about our generation only, but the impact is going to be our children, our grandchildren, and the future generation as well. So let us, work together and do our best in order to push, this noble agenda.
Well, Dr. Akram, from experience, I can certainly comment that our engagement with your good self and the other members of DDCAP's Sharia Supervisory Board actually led us to evolve this agenda and create the formal policies and approach to sustainable and responsible practices within our policy formation and our business model that we were striving to achieve. So I think ours was very much driven from the point of working collaboratively from the perspective of Sharia compliance as well. And you made some points when you were reflecting upon areas of resistance between Islam and the SDG. And it sort of led me to ask you whether you feel that combining the disciplines of more traditional aspects of Sharia financial oversight. So I guess I'm moving back to the model of some years ago where we were looking at the sort of straight compliance and the form of the instruments and the solutions that we were looking at. But is that really creating a bit of a gap with evolving international approach to sustainable and responsible financial practice? So for us, is that a bit of an unaddressed challenge? And there is some comment about the fact that, yes, in the Sharia compliant financial sector, we're starting to look at upscaling our green and sustainable solutions and our volume of contribution in monetary terms. And do you think that there is an inhibitor there in that dialogue that's stopping an acceleration of that upscaling?
Okay, usually to a certain extent, we can say that when you look into the development in the market and when you look into the principle of Sharia mainly, right? I would say that when we take the approach of pushing the agenda of sustainability, it is in line with Sharia. And the beauty thing about financial transaction, particularly in Sharia, is that the principle says that the origin of it is permissible, meaning that you can embark, you see, on whatever area you can innovate, you can come up with something new, you see, as long as it is within the boundary of Sharia. Now, the kind of resistance that I find is that it's only that, some people, I was having a conversation with some of the bankers a few days back, and some of them said, well, perhaps, if we look into if you bring the sustainability agenda and we look into the current criteria that we have developed and we have followed in ensuring Sharia compliant, perhaps if we put both together, as if we are trying to shrink, you see, the Sharia universe, because there will be two requirements. One is the Sharia requirement and one is the SDG, ESG, and whatnot, SRI requirement that is being put. So some people were of the view that, well, I mean, it might be, you know, a step that might hinder the further progress of the Islamic finance. But then I was telling them that, you see, when we talk about pushing the sustainability agenda, we might have different tiers of Sharia compliance. You see, one is the one that fulfill the basic fundamental requirement of Sharia. And the second tier, perhaps a better tier, is that you have a product which fulfill the basic requirement as well as fulfilling the sustainability agenda, as well as the ethical norms and whatnot. So perhaps moving forward, we might, you know, look and see that if we can develop, such mechanism, you see, in order for us to have not only halal, but it also tayyib. I think that is what we want to move forward. You see, we want a product that satisfies the requirement of Sharia, but at the same time, we know that this particular product, you see, whatever that we are pushing, it is also beneficial for the people. It is not bringing any harm to the people. So we need to bridge the gap between the market as well as the Sharia sphere. And I believe that we can always do this through the interaction between us.
Thank you, Dr. Laldin. I have so much more that I want to ask you, but unfortunately, I don't think our time together permits today. And I just say that I think summarizing the points of our discussion, we certainly know that Islamic finance has started to demonstrate innovations and financial engineering that supports the creation of those new instruments and solutions that will attract and deploy capital to deliver against the Sustainable Development Goals. And we certainly know that our sector has the capacity to mobilize funds to address meeting part of that $5 to $7 trillion annual funding gap. And that needs to be satisfied if we're going to achieve the 2030 target. And I think with a handful of notable exceptions, we know that our industry research shows that there's still quite limited engagement by the global Islamic financial sector with the SDGs, although on a positive note, the Islamic Development Bank's been a beacon in recent times amongst all multilaterals in this area. And I'm proud that the task force and its members and stakeholders are working hard to create awareness across borders and to educate and inform. And I think from your remarks, the message to us is clear that the Sharia scholars feel that we should be working collectively and collaboratively to focus on the opportunities that Sharia compliant, green and sustainable financial solutions do have to deliver with very positive impact against the targets and objectives of the goals. So Dr. Laldin, I thank you very much for the time that you've made available for our discussion today. And I look forward to continuing this dialogue with you soon.